My name is Ken Goosen, and I am the producer of Global Fest. And on behalf of the Calgary Fireworks Festival Society, that is our official name, I would like to welcome you all here to the annual Human Rights Forum breakfast. And I have a few brief remarks before we get into this morning's proceedings. And I will first beg your indulgence as I'm here on 4 hours of sleep as we were getting the festival park set up at Elliston Park, and we're looking at some weather modeling to see where exactly we go over the next few days, because it looks like it might be a little bit wet, but this is ever the life of an organization that is also an outdoor festival. The breakfast was an offshoot of the Human Rights Forum a number of years ago as a way of having a different kind of a dialogue. For many of you, you've been to the Calgary Public Library for the noon hour sessions, where we have a group of speakers. And for those who are lucky enough to get there for the first 100, they have a wonderful brown bag lunch, and the rest get to enjoy watching those people eat as the conversation goes along. So if you are going to be going to the Calgary Public Library for any of the remaining presentations, please make sure you get there early. There's some wonderful lunches by Indonesian Kitchen, and there's some wonderful conversations that are yet to be held. I would like to take a moment to just introduce a few of our honored guests here. We have the Honorable Kathleen Gainley, Minister of Justice. I'm going to make sure that I have the proper title here. I wrote it down. And here we go. Minister of Justice, Solicitor General for the Government of Alberta and MLA of Calgary-Buffalo. Thank you very much for joining us. We will have the Minister bringing a brief presentation shortly, a message from the province. We also have the Chairman of our board, Jason Ritchie. If you can just sort of wave your hand, Jason, so that people know where to look and target. And they talk to Jason. If you have any questions, talk to Jason. Jason has been around with us for many, many years, and we're appreciative of the work of our board of directors. I'm just wondering, Jason, have you seen any other directors here from the board? I haven't, but sometimes people slip by who we miss. And but if not, we will continue on. We're leading into a very busy week, and as I said, there's all the activity at the John Dutton Theatre. Tomorrow, subject to the weather being all good, we will open up Elliston Park for our 13th annual Global Fest at Elliston Park. Over the past 10 years, we've had 1.2 million people come through the gates to enjoy the One World Festival and the Trica Homes International Fireworks Festival. And it's a wonderful melting pot of the community. You see grandparents and grandchildren. You see not just generations, you see the entire cultural diversity of what is Calgary. When I first moved here 25 years ago, there was a very different city. And we really love where the city has come to. I mean, the city is a global center, and we have nationalities from around the world. We have business and commerce that is happening, that is transpiring around the world. It is a wonderful place. It's a dynamic, very vibrant community, and it really speaks to the mission and the mandate of the Fireworks Festival and the Global Fest and all of the underpinnings as to what we are, as to the work that we are doing within the community. A lot of people think of us just as a fireworks festival, except for those who are here who see the Human Rights Forum presentations. We also have an urban arts program where we're working with youth. And through in-school and after-school programs, we're using beatboxing, spoken word poetry, graffiti, graphic art, breakdancing as a way of helping youth to break out of isolation and into community. Because often we find these are ways of building community that they may not have thought of before. And that program is also breaking out of the city this year, and it's going provincial. So you may see the tag every once in a while, Alberta's most explosive festival, and we're exploding in schools, we're exploding in the sky, and we are explosive in our conversations at the Human Rights Forum from time to time. I understand those who were at the forum on Monday, it was a very hotly contested and discussed item, and we're talking about radicalization, something that there are a lot of polarized thoughts on. And that is what we're about. We're about bringing these to the surface, having honest conversations, agreeing to disagree, but being respectful in those conversations, asking questions, digging deeper, and finding out what are practical solutions as to where we can go. And that's sort of really what the mandate is of the Human Rights Forum. We couldn't do what we do without our volunteers. We have 2,000 volunteers. 800 of ours are operational, part of the Global Fest team. We have a team of 25 volunteer team leaders. We have a board of 8 volunteers who put in a lot of time and effort to make this all happen. But that's the Calgary way. All the best things are done by getting the community in. And so volunteers, Calgarians are the muscle that moves Global Fest and that move the community that we have. And so we thank our volunteers. An event like this would also not be possible without significant support. And we have a number of our principal sponsors here. We would like to thank TD Bank for being the presenting sponsor of the Human Rights Forum. And Renita, thank you so much for all of the support. And that support is going on multi-year. So we're pleased that TD will be here for a few years at least, and then we're going to continue those conversations. We also have representatives from Trico Homes, and Trico Homes is the presenting sponsor of the Calgary International Fireworks Festival, the Trico Homes International Fireworks Festival, one of those branded properties. Wanda, thank you for you and your team being here. It's a tremendously important partnership for us as well, as that supports so much of the activity that happens at Elliston Park. Other than and we would like to thank the Calgary Public Library. If it weren't for the John Dutton Theatre and the folks at the library, we would not be able to have a lot of the conversations that we have. I would also like to thank the International Hotel for providing this wonderful venue and the breakfast for us. This is a sponsored event, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank the International Hotel for making this morning possible. Going on, we also have additional sponsors for the human rights, the Alberta Human Rights Commission, Calgary Catholic Immigrant Services, Calgary Public Library, the Calgary Sun, CJSW, Hotel Blackfoot, Indonesian Kitchen, Sandart Calgary, Spirit Staffing, United Nations Association in Calgary. We have, and this is where I did not get all of my notes together, UFCW, Canada Locals 401 and 1118. And then we also have support from the Public Sector Alliance of Canada. And I would like to thank our union partners for their sponsorship in there. Shaw TV for capturing these presentations and for making them possible for people who were not here today to be able to watch these in the fall. So the backs of your heads may be noticed as you watch Shaw in the fall as we rebroadcast some of these presentations. If I have missed anybody, I will get my staff here to maybe help me correct that as I do. Closing remarks. I would like to thank our forum director, Anush Newman. Anush is new to us this year. Anush has been putting the entire forum together. So Anush, thank you very much. And with every leader, you have to have a right-hand person. And Samantha, where are you? Where is Sam? Is she around? Is Sam hiding in the back? So, okay. Sam, come over so people can see you. So there you go. Sam is one of our, what we call our YLOTs, our Youth Leaders of Tomorrow, a post-secondary student who's in a co-op program. So she's working for us for the summer, earning university credit, and learning a whole deal about human rights, about event management, and a lot of other projects, because Sam has been her hands have been in a lot of different pies throughout. So thank you very much. Aside from Samantha, we also have 3 other students who are not here this morning. Caitlin Davidson, Peter Hansen, and Adam Phillips. Some of our Youth Leaders of Tomorrow students are here from the University of Calgary. Others are here from the University of Victoria. We've had students from as far away as Western, out of Ontario, and so they all apply based on the events and the various programming aspects. So it's been a program we've had a lot of people who have gone through, and we're starting now to see our own staff complement, being rehiring some of these former students as they graduate into more activity within the organization. I'm going to now ask, we have a special guest, as I mentioned, and I would like to call upon the Minister of Justice, Kathleen Gainley, to bring a message from the province, and then I will introduce a few other special speakers as we go forward, and then we will have Amy join us and do our keynote.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we stand on Treaty 7 traditional territory. I'd also like to bring greetings on behalf of the provincial government. I'm the MLA for Calgary-Buffalo, which is right downtown. I'm also the Minister of Justice and Solicitor General, but I'm also the Minister of Aboriginal Relations for the province. So it's a great honor to be here today. As Albertans and Canadians and global citizens, we all have a role to continuing to build and uphold a society that is fair and just for everyone. When I ran for election here, I ran with the NDP in Calgary, which is not, I guess, traditionally a way to get elected. And my hope at the time was to sort of increase the discourse, because sometimes the way we in society talk about those who are different than us, whether through visible characteristics or whether through poverty or mental health, sometimes we don't do that in the most caring way. So I had hoped that I could move that discourse just a little, and I guess now I have the opportunity to move it a lot. A key priority of the Alberta government is the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. As directed by Premier Notley, all of us are currently in the process of reviewing our portfolios and policies to identify places where that declaration is already in place and places where we can move those policies so that we can implement the declaration in accordance with Canadian law. At its heart, this declaration speaks to Indigenous peoples' basic human rights, their rights to language, equality, and their rights to traditional use of the land. We will be working with Indigenous people and with industry to implement this declaration. Our government is also committed to ensuring that all Alberta families can benefit from our economy. One of our main policy platforms is to move the minimum wage to $15 over the course of the next 4 years. And the way that will affect equality is that certain groups, for instance, 62% of minimum wage earners are women, tend to be overrepresented in the lowest paid employment in Canada. I'm also interested in how the Human Rights Code can be used to enhance equality in our province. For example, we've been hearing from many people about the importance of the inclusion of the rights of transgender people, so rights surrounding gender identity and gender expression in the code, so we'll be looking into that going forward. So in closing, I'd just like to thank you all for coming here today. I think that these are some incredibly important conversations to have, and that human rights are incredibly important in the sense that they protect the most vulnerable in society, and we as a society, I think, can be judged in large part based on how we treat our most vulnerable. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to have representatives of the provincial government here to bring some greetings. I would also like to call upon Robert Philp, Queen's Counsel, Chief of the Commission and Tribunals, the Alberta Human Rights Commission, who's joining us this morning again. He was with us and participated last year. And Robert, it's wonderful to have you joining us again from Edmonton. It's nice to know that we have some folks from Edmonton who come down, and he's promised that one of these years he will come and stay long enough to be able to enjoy the fireworks as well.
Good morning, and thank you very much. And it is a pleasure to be at Global Fest again this year. And I'm looking forward to hearing Dr. Bombay's remarks. We met last year at an event in Edmonton, so I can tell you that you're going to hear a very, very powerful presentation this morning. I have no doubt about that. Like many of you and your organizations, the Commission actively collaborates with Aboriginal groups and organizations to build strong relationships and partnerships. As part of that engagement, we participated in the final Truth and Reconciliation Commission national event in Edmonton in 2014, and I suspect that many of you in this room attended that event as well. There, we heard survivors share their experiences, many of them traumatic, and learned about the truth and the impact of Indian residential school system. Supreme Court of Canada Chief Justice Beverley McLachlin described Canada's treatment of Aboriginal peoples as an attempt to commit cultural genocide, and it is the worst stain on Canada's human rights record. Chief Justice McLachlin described the relationship as, after an initial period of self-reliance and equality, Canada developed an ethos of exclusion and cultural alienation. This resulted in a legacy of racism and discrimination against the Aboriginal peoples that many contend with in their daily lives today. As part of our commitment to address the ongoing human rights issues that Alberta's Indigenous peoples face, the Commission is currently reviewing the 94 recommendations in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report to determine how they can inform our work and advance reconciliation in a meaningful way. While important initiatives to enhance human rights and increase understanding and mutual respect between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples are taking places in communities across Alberta, we know more needs to be done. I anticipate that Dr. Bombay's remarks will help deepen our shared understanding of the intergenerational impact and transfer of trauma. With that deeper understanding, we can all do a better job in engaging and moving forward from a very dark past towards a bright future of recovery and reconciliation. So I commend you to Dr. Bombay's remarks. I'm sure you'll learn something this morning. And on behalf of the Alberta Human Rights Commission, I can tell you that it is a pleasure to be a sponsor of this explosive event, and we hope to continue that relationship in the future. And next year, can you have the breakfast on Thursday, and then I can stay for the fireworks? Thank you.
We'll see what we can do. And finally, I would like to ask for one more guest to come up. And I'd like to call upon Renita Charania, Manager, Community Relations, Prairie Region, TD Canada Trust, to bring a message on behalf of the forum presenting sponsor. Renita.
Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to see some familiar faces. Can you hear me now that I've moved it down? Okay, wonderful. I am really pleased to be here on behalf of TD, what seems to be now a summer tradition. Really great way to meet some familiar faces and really get to know one another around some really important topics. This is our 8th year supporting Global Fest and the Human Rights Forum. And each year, the speakers and topics bring together an even more dynamic group to share experiences, knowledge, solutions to bring about change and create positive and safe communities. These topics sometimes inspire, motivate, agitate, anger at times the individuals participating, but that's okay. The forum really is about providing that space, a safe, comfortable environment where dialogue can happen and where controversial topics sometimes can be discussed. And sometimes, these controversial topics do cause that agitation and passion and emotion. And that's what TD's really proud to support, is providing that open, inclusive environment. At TD, we share a commitment to creating that positive communities where diversity is embraced and celebrated. TD participates and supports many outreach activities and initiatives with the aim of recognizing, encouraging, and celebrating diversity and building long-term relationships with the diverse communities in which we serve. In Canada, we designate at least 15% of TD's giving to diversity-related organizations. But more importantly, diversity for us is more than being competitive and relevant to the communities that we serve. It's about building an organization where people do not feel excluded in any way, regardless of their background, ethnicity, physical abilities or disabilities, gender, or sexual orientation. The Human Rights Forum has been offered since 2007 as part of Global Fest programming to promote diversity, cross-cultural respect, and equity in our community. For those of you who have not had a chance yet to go and participate in the lunch hour forums, I do encourage you to do that. As Ken mentioned, every lunch hour this week, the forum is being held at the Calgary Public Library. It's a great opportunity. I participated last year as well as this year. And it's an opportunity to really participate or observe in what issues are currently really relevant to individuals in our communities and to Calgarians. I would like to close by commending the Human Rights Forum and Global Fest teams for giving us the opportunity to experience a bold and refreshing look at what it means to build inclusive communities. We are pleased to support programs specifically designed to highlight multiculturalism, to break down barriers, and to bring communities together. I would like to take the opportunity to thank you for coming and joining us this morning. I know I'm very excited to hear Dr. Bombay speak about our topic, and I'm sure that each one of us will walk away with this morning as well as this week with some new information and will be inspired to continue building inclusive communities. Thank you.
I'm inspired already just having heard from the three individuals who've had speaking so far. There's a passion in the community. There's a passion for diversity. There's a passion to find solutions. There's a passion for engagement and embracing who we are and who our neighbors are. And on that note, I would like to thank Dr. Amy Bombay for coming all the way from Halifax to join us this morning and to be part of our team. We were very encouraged and excited with the conversation and where we see this going. So on behalf of Global Fest, Dr. Amy Bombay, we have you as our featured speaker this morning, Assistant Professor, Department of Psychiatry and School of Nursing at Dalhousie University. I'm going to leave it to the lady who knows what she's talking about. I am going to be her right hand working the machine there. We'll be communicating back and forth. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll have a few closing remarks. Remember, you have those wonderful Global Fest tickets to join us on Tuesday, which is Spain night, where we will also be celebrating a citizenship ceremony. We'll be having 100 individuals becoming Canadian citizens that night. Dr. Bombay.
Okay, well, thank you for all of those lovely introductions. I'm so happy to be here. This is actually my first time to Calgary. So I'd really like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Niitsitapi, the Nakota, and the Tsuut'ina. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing those 100% correctly. As I mentioned, this is my first time here on this territory, but I'd like to acknowledge them and thank them for welcoming. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, is in the next slide. My father is Ojibwe and grew up on a reserve in Rainy River First Nation in Ontario. After that, he moved to Ottawa for work, where he met my mother working for the government. And my mother's Irish. And so that's where I was born, and me and my brothers grew up as part of the urban Aboriginal population in Ottawa. Looking back, I recall situations growing up where students would tease me about my Aboriginal background, times where I felt ashamed about my heritage, even though my parents were really encouraging of us to be proud of our culture, but it was still a difficult thing to grow up with and not knowing a lot about my culture. So it wasn't really until later on in my life that I really started to identify strongly with my cultural background, which I think happened through my interest in really trying to understand why so many Aboriginal people face health and social problems, and why we see these disparities that continue to exist today. Another factor that really motivated me was finding out that my family, my grandparents, uncles, and aunts all attended residential schools. And growing up, I really had no idea what that meant. And so it was through my own research that I began exploring this, and really, it really seemed to instill a kind of social justice feelings in myself that really prompted me to do the work that I'm doing today. So as I already alluded to, and I'm sure you're aware, Indigenous peoples in Canada face numerous health and social disparities. And I'm just going to pop out here just to give you some examples. According to the UN Development Index, First Nations rank 63rd globally. And in Canada, based on a similar well-being index looking at communities, we found that 96 of the bottom 100 Canadian communities are First Nations, and there's only one First Nations community in the top 100. Next. And so I think one of the most devastating health and social issues that are facing some Aboriginal communities are the high rates of suicide, and particularly among youth. We know that in Aboriginal youth in Canada, rates are estimated to be about 7 to 8 times the national average, and this is even higher in some communities, as you can see on the graph on the left. Although we all hear about suicide in First Nations communities, we know that rates are very variable across communities, so these factors are not affecting each community in the same way. And so we can't assume that all communities are, all having these high levels of distress, as some are doing well and some are doing better. So it was our job to try to understand the risk factors and the protective resilience factors that seem to differentiate those who are doing, living better lives and those who are still suffering from their past trauma. Next. So often, differences in health status observed between groups can be explained by the fact that the two populations differ in other health-determining respects, such as physical environments they live in, such as their income and education, and both socioeconomic status and physical environments in turn affect the ability to live a healthy life as well. So just for example, for some statistics from a national representative survey of First Nations living on reserve, we found that 37.5% of children, First Nations children in communities, live in overcrowded homes. And we found that approximately 43% of children live in a household with an annual income of less than $20,000. And in looking at health behaviors, we found that 46.9% of mothers reported they had smoked during their pregnancy, which was in turn linked to lower birth rate in their babies. So these are just examples of a lot of the different factors affecting communities. So next. So members of groups who have histories of oppression are also more likely to face additional types of stressors and trauma throughout their lives. Okay. So looking at the childhood stress and trauma exposure, again, there are high rates of child abuse and neglect in some communities, again, not all communities. First Nations adults are 4 times more likely to have encountered severe trauma compared to the general population, and that includes all different types of traumas, like being in car accidents, things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, but for some reason they face higher rates of exposure to these types of stress and trauma. Of course, Aboriginal women are almost 3 times more likely than non-Aboriginal women to be a victim of a violent crime, as we've already talked about. There's a huge problem of missing and murdered Aboriginal women in Canada we have not yet addressed. So even when we look at these current health disparities and we control for things like differences in socioeconomic status, we control for even differences in regular stressors and trauma throughout lives, we still find that these disparities continue to exist. And so what that means is, and suggests, is that there are factors and risks that go along with simply being a member of these historically oppressed groups, that in itself is a risk factor. And this happens in part by being exposed to additional culture-related stressors that mainstream people aren't exposed to. For example, one of the most obvious contemporary of these is exposure to racism and discrimination, and this is really prevalent in Canada. In our study, which is a national study of First Nations living on reserve, we found that 32.6 reported experiencing racism in the past year, which we actually found was really quite low. And when we compared that, and it might be because it might be differences in terms of living on and off reserve, because when we sampled a large sample of Aboriginal peoples from across Canada and asked them if they've experienced any types of discrimination and racism in the past year, we had 99% who responded yes to that. And this sample was actually of higher income. So it's not just those who are in poverty that are being discriminated. It's still a big problem in Canada that Aboriginal peoples face interpersonal discrimination on a regular basis. So next. So in addition to the greater exposure to such personal level cultural stressors, some have also faced major collectively experienced trauma and stress throughout history that's also linked with present-day health and social outcomes. In contrast to personally experienced trauma, a collective trauma refers to one that is experienced by members of the same group, and it can be something that's done purposely to hurt these groups, or it can be something like a natural disaster. But the whole idea is that it affects a group who share the same social identity. And so many groups have had to face these types of collective traumas throughout history. Obviously, the Holocaust is a major example. And through colonization, Indigenous groups in Canada and other countries have had to continue to face multiple group-based stressors since the arrival of European settlers. So, colonization can be viewed as one big collective stressor, but in reality, what it has been is that these groups have faced numerous chronic exposure to major collective traumas. And the one I'll be talking about today and focusing on our research is the long-term effects of the Indian residential school system, which was specifically designed by the government to kill the Indian in the child. So I'm sure most of you have heard the history behind these schools by now, but just in case, these schools ran in Canada from the mid-1800s until the last school closed in 1996. During this time, Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their parents, who were threatened with imprisonment and other punishments if they tried to keep their children at home. Children who attended experienced various types of abuse, various types of neglect, and they were exposed on a daily basis to racism and shaming about who they are, about their parents, and about their cultural identity, because that was really the whole point of it. So although the colonizers were not successful in destroying Indigenous cultures, as we're still here today, which I think really speaks to our resilience, they were not incorrect regarding the importance of early life experiences in contributing to healthy development. So it's commonly accepted that adverse conditions early in life, so now I'm just going to back up and do a little quick biology lesson before I really get into my research. It's commonly accepted that adverse conditions early in life can severely impact the developing brain and increase vulnerability to mood and other mental and physical disorders later in life. So particularly relevant to the research that I'm going to be talking about is that it's known that adversity early in life is able to shape the maturation of stress-regulating pathways that underlie our emotional functions and our physiological responses to stress. And this can lead to long-lasting altered stress responsivity throughout adulthood. And just as an example, is one mechanism through this works is that adverse conditions can result in vulnerability to consequences of further stress through what we call epigenetic changes. And these are changes in the expression of our genes. So although we're born with our with our DNA sequence, what we've learned is that experience can basically turn these genes on or off, which can result in stable and lasting changes in the gene functioning, which can continue through adulthood and in some cases can actually be passed on to the next generation. So the nature of the environment throughout later life, after experiencing childhood adversity or not, in addition to the impacts of other factors such as sex and age, can exacerbate the effects of programming established early in life, resulting in an increased vulnerability to mood disorders and other negative mental and physical health outcomes. So essentially, early life stress can result in changes in the development of the biological trajectory so that stress systems are more reactive, so that later challenges can elicit more profound effects. So indeed, large-scale representative studies that have done in various countries that have looked at various numbers of different types of childhood adversity have revealed graded relationships between the number of childhood adversities exposed to and the number of negative health outcomes they've experienced in adulthood. So as we can see, there's this kind of graded relationship between, and the bottom line is the number of adverse childhood experiences they were exposed to. And we see this linear link with the risk for a number of different negative outcomes in adulthood. Similarly, these are just similar studies have found the same linear relationships with respect to various physical health outcomes, various specific mental health outcomes, and as well other social behavioral outcomes, including things like being at risk for perpetrating intimate partner violence, for being a victim of perpetrator violence, and a number of other negative outcomes. Just make sure. So considering the chronic exposure to the various forms of adversity faced by those who attended residential school, it should not be unexpected that research has since shown that those who attended themselves, so who we often refer to as residential school survivors, are at risk for various mental and physical health problems, considering the chronic and numerous types of adversities they were exposed to, for in many cases, throughout their childhood into adolescence. Okay. So it's only been within the past 10 years that the Canadian government apologized for the residential school system, which was accompanied by the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as already mentioned, and this provided a forum for survivors to share their stories. And although the TRC has done much to educate Canadians about the existence of the residential school system, the significance and these long-term impacts that we know exist are still not understood by many Canadians. For example, this quote that I'm sharing with you was written online in response to a CBC News article about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and residential schools. So just to read it to you, this person wrote, in response to reading about the TRC, "Just get the whole thing over with and be done with it. Good Lord, what a farce. What exactly are they trying to prove? That there were some bad situations? We all know that, and the story and the survivors have been paid millions for it. Say your piece, cash your check, and get on with life." So clearly, this quote, and if you go online, you'll see many others like that, really represents what my colleague, who's a professor at McMaster, has documented and termed laissez-faire racism, which is really common against Aboriginal peoples in Canada and towards some other groups as well. But basically, this is the tendency to blame Aboriginal peoples for their social inequities, which is also accompanied by resistance to support policies to address these issues. And he's found, particularly his work was done in northwestern Ontario, and he found that these were very widespread in that part of Canada, and he's currently looking at them in other parts of Canada, but we think it's probably about the same. So it was in part because of such widespread denial that we were encountering regarding the significant and long-term consequences of the residential school that my colleagues and I began the research that I'm about to talk to you about, which really focuses on documenting various intergenerational effects of residential schools. Flashing back to the next one, sorry. So far, we really focused on looking at mental health outcomes, as that's what people are coming to and what's leading to these high rates of suicide. So just to show you a couple of our studies, in our top one, we first looked at adults who lived across Canada off reserve. And we compared those who had a parent to those who had at least one parent who went to residential schools to those whose families were not affected, both Aboriginal. And we found those whose parents went to residential school reported higher levels of depressive symptoms, which we just measured by asking them about their symptomatology using a standardized scale. And another study which looked at a representative sample of First Nations adults living on reserve, we found the same thing. So we were finding this both on and off reserve. And our this lower graph is looking at a representative sample of First Nations youth aged 12 to 18. And what we can see is that even early in their life, we're already seeing signs of the effects of intergenerational trauma. As we can see right here, that those were the groups that had no parents who went to residential school, and they were the least likely to report having depressed mood. Those who had one parent who went to residential school were at a slightly higher risk, and those who had both parents who went to residential school were the most likely to report experiencing depressed mood. Oh, yeah. Okay. Hopefully this will work better. Okay. So this is another slide that we've done, and we found that this is a very powerful thing. So I think another thing that people don't really seem to realize about the residential schools is that this happened over several generations. And so in some generations, we found people reporting that there was 5 generations in their family who went to residential school. So of course, they're not going to have any time for healing when they're constantly being sent back. And so what we found that the number of generations in their families is also a significant risk factor and shows the cumulative effects of these collective traumas over time. So we found that those whose First Nations parents, families who were not affected by residential schools reported the lowest levels of psychological distress. We found that adults who had one parent or one grandparent who attended, so they had just basically one previous generation in their family who attended, they were at slightly higher risk. And those who had 2 previous generations in their family who attended, so a parent and a grandparent, were at the highest risks. And so again, remember, none of these people attended themselves. These are all just the intergenerational effects. And I'd just like to point out that this research that we've been doing with Aboriginal peoples in Canada is very consistent with some of the work that's been done with other populations that have undergone similar collective race-based traumas. Most of the work has been done within the context of the Holocaust, where children of Holocaust survivors are compared to those whose families were not affected. And again, they found similar findings of increased depressive symptoms, increased post-traumatic stress disorder, They've also shown evidence of increased physiological difference that seem to be involved. They found differences in a stress hormone called cortisol. And they've also found evidence of these epigenetic effects, which I spoke about. We haven't looked at that yet in our research, but we can expect that this is definitely a pathway that's involved in the transmission across generations. Other groups have also undergone major collective traumas, and documented and intergenerational effects have been documented in Japanese Americans and in those who were affected by the Armenian genocide. And there are many other collective traumas that have affected major groups of people as well. So the next thing we wanted to do after establishing, okay, we know these intergenerational effects exist, we really wanted to try to start to figure out why this was the case. What are the pathways involved in the transmission across generations, so that we can hopefully find ways to intervene and stop these cycles. And so the first thing we looked at, which was I think most intuitive based on the anecdotal reports that those who went to residential schools really did not learn their parenting styles, and instead their traditional parenting was replaced with models of abusive parenting. And so we really expected that those whose parents went to residential school would report higher levels of adverse childhood experiences, and that's exactly what we found. We found that those who had at least one parent who went to residential school reported an average of about 4.5, almost 5 different childhood adverse experiences while growing up. So again, this could include different types of neglect, abuse, and also having a parent who has a mental health disorder, having a parent who has a substance abuse disorder, and all of these other things that typically go along with abuse and neglect. Because what research in other groups have shown is that these various forms of childhood adversity tend to occur together. And so it's important to look at all of these negative experiences so we can really understand how they're related to negative outcomes in adulthood. So the next thing we wanted to look at was whether, okay, we know they experience more childhood adversity. Does this seem to continue throughout their adulthood? And that's exactly what we found. We found that those whose parents went to residential school, and this is the same people that we're surveying, they were also more likely to be exposed to various types of trauma in their adulthood. And this is also consistent with research in other groups who have shown evidence for this process called stress proliferation, in which an initial challenge or adverse experiences tends to give rise to additional experiences. And I think once we really think about that, it makes a lot of sense. If someone's growing up in a really bad situation, it's unlikely that they're all of a sudden going to be given all of these opportunities to be healthy. And so we find that these early life trajectories really seem to be important in influencing the rest of their lives. So the third stressor that we looked at was perceived discrimination. In a lot of our interviews that we had conducted with children of survivors, the issue of discrimination and racism was something that kept coming up. So we wanted to explore this and seeing if this was involved in the transmission of residential school trauma. And although we can't really figure out why this was the case from this particular study, we did find that those who had at least one parent who went to residential school were more likely to report encountering racism and discrimination in their daily lives. And if we go to the next slide, we see that, and this is a special statistical technique that we use to model the relationships between these variables. And we found that those who had a parent who went to residential school was more likely to have higher levels of adverse childhood experiences, and that accounted for their increased risk for further experiencing adult traumas and perceived discrimination. And that those adult traumas in turn accounted for their increased risk for depressive symptoms. And okay, so we're still on the same study here that we did, and we've already shown that those who were affected by residential schools are exposed to more stressors. But we also found in these graphs and have shown that not only are they exposed to more stressors, but they're also more vulnerable to the negative effects of these stressors. So in the top graph, we've shown that those who have different levels of adverse childhood experiences, this is those who had at least one parent who attended and those who had no parents who attended. And so we know that those who had those who had at least one parent who attended, I think those should be mixed. It should be those with higher levels of childhood adversity and who went to residential school were the ones who had the highest levels of depressive symptoms. And those who had those who had high levels of childhood adversity but were not affected by residential schools weren't affected as much. And interestingly, we found the same finding when we looked at a study that compared Holocaust children to those whose families were not affected by the Holocaust. And so they found that those with a non-Holocaust background compared to those with the Holocaust background, and this is depressive symptoms here, those who were diagnosed with cancer, which they operationalized as being a stress, those with the Holocaust background were way more affected by this in terms of their depressive symptoms, whereas those who were not affected by the Holocaust were better able to cope with their diagnosis and did not get as affected by their diagnosis. And just to show you that we found the exact same patterns when we looked at the number of adult traumas and perceived discrimination. So again, those with at least one parent who went to residential school, when they're exposed to high discrimination, they're the ones at the most risk for these negative outcomes. So the next thing that we were really interested in exploring after that first study we did was to try to find out why the children of survivors seem to be perceiving more discrimination, as this seemed to be a really key factor in contributing to their vulnerability. So one of the factors we were really interested in exploring is whether these two groups might vary in their tendency of making certain cognitive appraisals in response to intergroup encounters with non-Aboriginal people. Research in other minority groups have shown that the effects of such intergroup encounters ultimately depend on whether they elicit appraisals of the incident as being due to discrimination on the part of the person they're interacting with. But even if an encounter is appraised as reflecting discrimination, some might perceive it as threatening to their well-being and be very, offended and affected by it, whereas others might not be particularly bothered and are able to brush it off. And so it's really when an encounter is appraised as constituting discrimination and as threatening to the individual that we expect that these negative emotional reactions will occur, which are followed by behavioral and biological efforts to cope with these situations. And when these occur on a daily basis, this can be really harmful to your stress response system. So in this study, we wanted to see whether this was more likely to be the case among children of survivors relative to those who had not been affected by residential schools. And we did this by assigning participants to read a series of scenarios depicting potentially discriminatory events and to answer questions. So the next one. So as predicted, children of survivors were more likely to appraise the scenarios. The next one, yeah. And you can press. So as the children of survivors were more likely to appraise these scenarios we gave them as reflecting discrimination. So if they had a parent at residential school, they were more likely to say, yes, these scenarios reflect discrimination. And then they were subsequently more likely to say, this is going to affect me. I'm feeling emotions about it, just reading about it. It's threatening to my well-being. And in turn, that put them at risk for their higher levels of depressive symptoms. So we also wanted to look at some of the other variables that might be involved in this sequence. And we were really interested in cultural identity, as that's another issue that would come up with our qualitative interviews we did. And so we looked at identity centrality, which is really the part of your collective and cultural identity that refers to the salience of your group membership. So how important is my Aboriginal heritage to my self-concept? Do I think about it a lot? Is it a big part of me? And so what we found was that those who had a parent who went to residential school were more likely to report that they thought about their Aboriginal identity a lot, which can have some really positive effects. For those who have a lot of pride, that can be a good thing, to think about your background when you have a lot of pride. But in some cases, for example here, it actually put people at risk for attributing these scenarios to discrimination. So, that fed into their kind of risk for depressive symptoms. We also found that past experiences of discrimination were also more likely to make the individuals attribute these scenarios to discrimination. And so what we see, and I kind of have this one-way area, but what's likely is it's really this kind of cycle where you are exposed to discrimination, and then you become more sensitized to it, which makes you perceive more and continually putting people at risk. What we also found is, in addition to these pathways, there still was this kind of direct pathway between past discrimination and depressive symptoms, suggesting that there's still other factors that are involved. And so we explored that a bit further in some of our next research. So in our next study, we really wanted to start exploring some of the things early in life that might be affecting them, because our research is really pointing to the importance of early life experiences. And before we did that, we were interested in communication. So did their parents speak to them about residential schools? Did their parents speak to their children about what it meant to be an Aboriginal person? And whether this differed among those who were affected by residential schools and not. And so this is a graph just looking at children of survivors. And we asked them, when did they first learn about that their parent went to residential school? And so what we found was that about a third said that they learned that their parents went to a residential school in childhood. About another third said they didn't learn this until they were adolescents. And still a remaining third, about 20% said they learned it in their adulthood, in their young adulthood, and even about just over 10% said they didn't learn it until they were their older adulthood. So they never knew throughout their whole life that their parents went to residential schools. And so what we found was that many also described these different patterns of communication. So for that 1/3 who maybe knew about that their parents went to residential schools growing up, a lot of them also described that although they knew, they didn't really have an understanding of what it meant and how it affected their parents and what it meant for Aboriginal peoples. So we heard a lot of people who talked about, they didn't know, but they heard these indirect communications about residential school while growing up. This was just one example of a quote from one of our participants. I'd overhear conversations between my mom and other community members. No one ever explained anything to me. I would ask questions and receive brief answers from my grandmother. Another common theme we heard from our participants was that they would also pick up on nonverbal communications from their parents, suggesting that something had happened. This person shared that I don't think my parents ever really talked about it while I was growing up. My older siblings would talk about residential school and how our grandfather and father attended, though I never really heard any details until early adulthood. I think that at some point as a child, I understood that my father acted in such a way with us, unemotional, harsh punishments, due to his upbringing, and I had some vague idea that it related to residential school. I don't think I truly understood how large of an impact it's had on my life until the last 6 to 7 years. And so we also, again, trying to look at this quantitatively, because we found that there had been a lot of qualitative work done, but that doesn't seem to be what convinces people. People want to see the evidence. And so that's what we've been trying to do with this quantitative work. And it really does show the same story. So we found that those whose parents went to residential school were more likely to report being exposed to this kind of indirect communication about residential schools while growing up. We asked those whose parents went to residential school, how often did your parents speak to you about residential schools as an incidental topic in passing, just as an example, and they were asked to rate that. And those whose parents did not attend were just asked about how much their parents spoke about residential school in passing in general. We also asked about this nonverbal communication that many described by asking, based on your parents' behavior, how often did you get the feeling that your parent was still being impacted by past negative experiences that happened to them? So in both cases, those with a parent in residential school reported higher indirect communication about residential school, higher nonverbal communication, and both these fed into higher levels of discrimination as adulthood that they were perceiving. We also found that these two aspects of cultural identity that we had been finding that people were talking about to us a lot were also involved in this. Again, that centrality, which is the importance of one's cultural background to their self-concept, was higher in those who thought about this, who thought about their heritage, and that put them at risk for depressive symptoms. And on the other hand, this in-group affect, that's really referring to cultural pride. And so those who were hearing all of this, picking up on this nonverbal communication while knowing that residential schools exist, seem to lead to decreases in their cultural pride. And of course, that also put them at risk for perceiving higher levels of discrimination. And finally, at the same time we were measuring all of these other things, I know this gets a bit complicated, but we also measured just their general quality of communication, so not focusing on residential schools, but just parent-child communication. And again, that was also lower among those whose parents went to residential school and independently contributed to their depressive symptoms. So we heard from those whose parents, they knew they went, and their parents kind of never really directly talked about them. But there was also a proportion of our participants who described that, yes, their parents did talk to them in childhood, but sometimes they talked about it too much in an overly adult terms and overly graphic terms, often because the parent didn't have any support themselves. So this person shared, my mother shared her experiences with me, and it was frightening. As a child, I always felt sorry for her because the system had been so mean to her. I felt like a small adult when she told me the horrible stories. She would tell these stories mostly when she was drunk, and she would cry. I felt very sad and afraid. So again, we wanted to look at this quantitatively, and we found that those who rated that they constantly heard these negative stories about residential schools from their parents was associated with them thinking about their Aboriginal identity more, and again contributed to higher levels of discrimination and depressive symptoms. In contrast, again, we found that hearing about all of these negative things about residential schools that had been done to Aboriginal people in turn led to reduced in-group affect, which again is basically cultural pride. So hearing about them as kids, they were likely to not feel proud growing up. And again, that put them at risk for negative outcomes. And so one of the other themes that really came up in some of our qualitative work was this kind of tension between cultural pride and cultural shame. And shame, internalized racism, the denial of cultural identity were stories that we heard way too often from our participants. So this is just one quote that was shared with us. My mother was taught to be ashamed of her Aboriginal identity. This caused her to struggle for some sense of belonging. She even talked down about Aboriginal people because of their misfortune. As a kid, I remember being ashamed when my mother came to school because I was often called names such as wagon burner and savage. Today, I'm so ashamed of the shame I experienced as a child, and I'm so angry that my parents never taught me to be proud of who I was. And so this is one of the other themes that we commonly heard when asking our participants if their parents spoke to them about what it means to be an Aboriginal person. And many described this idea of the promotion of mistrust, that they can't trust anyone, particularly non-Aboriginal people. But at the same time, there is messages of discrimination against their own people. So it was very confusing for children. So this person said, no, when we asked them, did your dad talk to you about what it meant to be an Aboriginal person? They said, no, my dad just told me that people did not like Indian children and that we should not trust white people. And at the same time, he told us that Indian people were useless and stupid. He said that we should not be like most Indians and go on welfare. So there are a lot of mixed messages. So far I've kind of really focused on some of the negative findings of our research, which I think serves its place and is really important for everybody to learn about, to begin to understand why these health and social disparities exist today and continue to exist. But I think it's also very important to recognize the resilience of Aboriginal peoples, and that despite everything they've gone through, they're still going through cultural revitalizations, and communities are reviving their cultures and becoming stronger. And it really seems, based on our research and the stories that were shared with us, that this is an important part of resilience and staying strong. This person shared with us, I think my mom showed me more than she told me. She is a very traditional and has practiced our culture in front of me when she could. My mother remained a very traditional woman and has maintained her language. My mother has always been a very proud Native woman. And this person went on to say how this was really protective for them, even though her mom didn't really verbally discuss these things with her. Those messages were sent and was protective for her. So what we've also found is exactly what I just said, is that learning about intergenerational effects and the importance of culture has been healing for many. It's important for non-Aboriginal peoples to begin to understand and have empathy, and for Aboriginal peoples, because a lot of us we're not aware of these issues growing up ourselves, it's important for us to learn about it. And we found that those who have shared those stories describe that it has caused healing in families, healing in communities, because they now understand, why certain things happened the way they did. So this person shared, I'm working on reconciling within myself my own shame, my own history, and resolving those issues so I can be a better representation of myself as an Aboriginal woman. So again, just to mention, so far I've been speaking about these kind of individual level effects of residential schools. But it's also important to recognize that these effects don't manifest themselves only at these individual levels. That when you go to First Nations communities or communities in the city that have a large urban Aboriginal population, these collective effects are greater than the sum of its parts. So as shown in other groups who have undergone major collective effects at the family and community levels have been shown to modify social dynamics, processes, structures, and functioning. And as I mentioned, these are greater than the sum of the effects on individuals who are individually or intergenerationally affected by residential schools. And so we did another study in which we interviewed a whole bunch of service providers, psychologists, psychiatrists who had worked with Aboriginal communities over the years to talk about what they saw as the collective effects as a result of residential schools. And this is just one of them, and they felt one of the most negative effects has been the effect on community relationships, on social support networks, and in contributing to this internalized racism and oppression that we were seeing at the individual level of people describing these shame and all of those things. And so this is just a quote from one of our service providers who took part in this study. We're dealing with family dysfunction, family fights in different parts of the community, and so on. Why is that? Why do we as Aboriginal people tend to be mean to one another? whether it's lateral violence, gossip, rumor, backstabbing, and even outright anger, sometimes leading to deaths, violent deaths. Why is that? I think you can make linkages to what we've been talking about, and that was residential schools. Additional collective effects in communities that were identified by service providers was not only, as we described this, silence within families, but that there has been a silence regarding residential school experiences across communities. You have this sense of silence in some communities. And also there's silence about the contemporary effects, like high rates of child abuse, and these are things that no one seems to want to talk about. Often because they're not ready and they're not healthy enough to talk about them. Other collective effects have been effects on community violence and childhood abuse, effects on community leadership. In a lot of cases, we've heard stories that the chief and council who are trying to do their best themselves have not healed from the residential school system, and often family feuds and things that happen in such small communities stem from things that actually happen in the residential school system. And of course, because of all of these individual family and community effects, they've also commented on just the general effects, wide-ranging effects on these communities. So one of the other things we were really interested in is looking at, we focused our research on residential schools, but we know that residential schools is only one of many collective traumas faced by Aboriginal peoples, with one more recent being the 60 scoop, where large numbers of Aboriginal children, as the residential school was coming to end, began being taken from their homes and put in foster care. And so this is a quote from Lawrence Kermeyer, who's an expert in Aboriginal mental health issues. Many have argued that the child welfare system, through its large-scale removal of Aboriginal children from their families, culture, and communities, to be considered a continuation of the policies of forced assimilation of the residential school system. Today, we know that about 50% of children under the age of 14 in foster care are Aboriginal, despite the fact that they make up only 3.4% of the population, so 50%. And so we were really interested if there was a statistical link between being affected by residential schools and then subsequently by being put into foster care. And so that's exactly what we found. We found that the number of generations in one's family who went to residential school was directly linked to whether or not they spent any time growing up in a foster care or in a group home while growing up. And we wanted to find out, what was the pathway involved in this. And we have actually updated this slide since. We initially just looked at this self-reported childhood stability, which was in fact involved. But what we subsequently found out was it's really childhood economic stability while they were growing up. And so it really seemed to be the poverty that was not allowing these parents to provide adequate environments for their children. Even if they're doing their best, they simply didn't have the means to do so. And so because of that, and of course that's the effects of residential schools, but of course that is just feeding into this new cycle of removal of Aboriginal children and really recreating all of the same problems. So what are the implications of these findings? I think it's clear that past collective traumas are linked with current health disparities. It shows the increased needs that are faced by these groups are linked with familial residential school attendance. We see individual, family, and community level effects of residential schools have resulted in these cycles of childhood adversity, and that these cycles of adversity are overlapping and accompanied by cycles of poor communication, mental illness, low socioeconomic status, and substance abuse. And so right now, these cycles seem to be continuing because we are not taking the adequate holistic approaches that need to be taken to stop them. And so without intervening in these cycles, the risk for continuing these negative outcomes across generations is quite high. Again, to try to end on some good notes, this research also has implications for prevention and interventions. As I mentioned, learning about residential schools seems to be healing for some. This person shared, "I found out when I was 27 that my father attended residential school. My sister told me. My father has never spoken to me about it. I read his court statements without his knowledge, and this is where I learned about the sexual, physical, emotional, and cultural abuse he endured. I was deeply saddened, but it gave me an understanding of why my father behaves the way he does. It helped me understand the cycle of abuse because in turn he abused my mother and I. He learned these behaviors in residential school and could not cope, so he turned to alcohol, and so did I. But at the moment, I am in treatment and I'm dealing with these issues. I can break the cycle." And finally, just one more positive quote I'd like to share. This person shared that I was ashamed growing up, but I've since reclaimed my identity. Now that I'm on my own, I have more pride and I'm learning to love my identity. I gave my son a traditional Ojibwe name and I vow to raise him to be proud of who he is. So again, you know, this particular quote is speaking to the positive intergenerational transmissions that are starting to happen and that we need to support and encourage. And just to emphasize the importance of cultural pride, this is from one of our other studies who looked at the relationship between perceived discrimination and depressive symptoms, which was very strong. But when we separated our sample into those with high levels of cultural pride versus those with low levels of cultural pride, we found it was those with high cultural pride who really seemed to not be as affected by perceived discrimination. So it was those who felt good about their cultural background that can kind of brush it off, deal with it positively, whereas those who had no pride are the ones that are at risk for negative outcomes. And so I think one of the take-homes is that we really need to support Aboriginal people in regaining pride, and I think Canada itself needs to be proud of their Aboriginal peoples and their Aboriginal heritage. Thank you.